This is the evening before Good Friday. It was the evening when Jesus celebrated the Pesach, the Passover. I would like to just briefly review that moment in the Hebrew scriptures and then make a New Testament application. So as we look at Exodus chapter 12, the Lord tells Israel, every man shall take a lamb. Notice, Vayikahu lahem ish seh, a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a house. And notice what the lamb is to be. And if the house is too small, by the way, then it is to be shared with the house next door. Every man according to their number, so that everyone can participate of the lamb. I see the New Testament teaching the universal Christ died for everyone, making it available for all. And notice the lamb, then, set tamim zachar ben shana yeh lachem, min ha kevasim umin ha izim tekachu. That is, the lamb shall be without blemish. It shall be a male of the first year. As I look at parallels, Christ was without blemish. He who knew no sin became a sin offering for us, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Jesus came as a male, as the God-man. And notice we're speaking of one who is young here, a male lamb of the first year, Ben Shana. Jesus died as a young man in the height, really, as we would say, around 30 years of age. Jesus died. And notice it goes on to say, you shall take the lamb and watch it until the 14th day. V'haya lachem lemishmeret ad arba'a asa yom. You're going to watch it until the 14th day of the same month. And I'm reminded of how Jesus was observed, that which we have seen, that which we have handled. 1 John says, closely watch. And then, V'shachatu oto kol kahal adat Yisrael ben ha'arbayim. That is, and then all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings. It is interesting, Josephus talks about this idea between the evenings. Christ died between the evenings on the 14th day, probably of Nisan. And then notice it goes on to say what you do with the blood of the lamb. You will take from the blood, v'lakachu min hadam, v'natanu al shetei ha-mezuzot, v'al ha-mashkof. That is, you're going to take of the blood and you're going to sprinkle it on the two side posts and on the lintel upon the houses, where then you will eat it. And I'm reminded of the sacrifice requiring blood. A little bit later in the chapter, it talks about how one would take hyssop and apply it to the lintel and over the doorpost. And it's interesting, without the shedding of blood, we're told there's no remission of sins. And Paul will say we have redemption through his blood, through the sacrifice of Christ. Furthermore, as we look at the parallels They then were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. Notice v'achlu et habasar b'layla hazeh. That is, you shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire, tzalei esh, and with unleavened bread. Matzot al, with unleavened bread, not raw. Notice he goes on to say, with bitter herbs, I should say, al merorim yochaluhu. That is, you shall eat it with bitter herbs, which would remind them of the slavery that they went through in the land of Egypt. And when we think of what the Lord has done, we can be reminded of our life of the past, of sin, and how the Lord has delivered us from the power of sin and from the power of Satan. And notice it is not to be eaten raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast in fire. Ki'im sali esh, the whole of it. And I think this looks at the judgment that Jesus faced for sins, that he willingly faced. No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down. It was a total consuming sacrifice. And none of it was to be left until the morning. It is also interesting, oftentimes you talk to people and you say, do you know Jesus? Oh, yes, I accepted him when I was a boy, but nothing seems to have changed. In other words, it has to be fresh, our relationship with Christ. It can't be something that has been done a long time ago. It's an everyday thing. You don't keep it until the morning. And they're to eat it girded with the shoes on their feet, staff in their hands, and eat it in haste. V'achaltem oto b'chifazos Pesach b'chifazon, in haste. Pesach hu le'Adonai. It is the Passover of the Lord. And I think the thought here is that we are pilgrims, and having taken of the Passover, partaken of it in Christ, we are to be traveling on, so to speak, living our life in passing on this journey for Christ. We're not to settle in and just realize that's it. They were pilgrims going to another land. We're headed for a promised land if we have our faith in Jesus. And then he goes on to say how he's going to smite the land and execute judgment, but the blood would be a token upon your houses. Notice verse 13. V'haya hadam lachem la'ot al habatim asher atem sham. Upon the houses where you dwell. And I love this. V'rayiti et hadam, when I see the blood. Fasakti alechem, I will pass over you, and I will not smite you then when I am going to bring destruction. I won't bring it upon you. And how true that is in New Testament thought. We have deliverance. We have redemption through his blood, Paul says in Ephesians, the book of Ephesians. And this is in Ephesians chapter 1. Then he goes on to talk about how 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. Shivat yamim mitzvot tochelu. In other words, 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread, and no leaven is to be in your houses. You're to take it all out of your house. Kikol ochel chametz, that is, you shall not eat with leaven, but you shall take it out of your houses. For whoever eats with leaven, that soul shall be cut off. In other words, whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh, that soul shall be cut off. In other words, you don't eat leaven. In the New Testament, Paul makes application, a wonderful application in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where he's dealing with sinful practices at Corinth. And he uses this example back here by saying, Ekatarata tain palayan sumain, that is, purge out the old leaven, in order that you might be a new lump, kathos esta atsumoi, just as you are in leaven. For kaigar tapaska chemon etuthe Christos, for Christ our Passover is sacrificed on our behalf. Therefore, let us keep the feast not in the old leaven. Notice, hosta ortadzomen me in sume palaya, neither in the leaven of wickedness and pornerias, fornication, but in the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Al in atsumoi elekrineas kai aletheas. In other words, Paul uses the example of eating unleavened bread and applies it to the Christian life. And so Christ becomes, in 1 Corinthians 5, our Passover. And having experienced that, we then live a life of holiness, Paul says. We should be living without leaven being a picture of sin, and try to ask the Lord to help us not yield to the flesh and its sinful desires. And then as we come to the end of Exodus 12, the other interesting thing is that not a bone was broken. Notice of that lamb. Notice verse 47. Ve'etzim lo tishbaru vo. Not a bone shall you break. And I'm reminded in the Gospels how that those that were crucified with Christ, they had to break their bones, because that way they would not be able to lift themselves up to breathe on the cross. But Jesus had already died, so there was no need to break his bones. And I'm reminded Christ died after he had finished the work upon the cross, and he said, Tetelestai, it has been finished. And he died voluntarily at that point. In other words, he gave his spirit back to the Father, and showing again that he was divine and that the work had been finished. And the veil of the temple was rent in two. So this Passover becomes a beautiful prediction of what happened on the cross of Calvary. And it was eaten on that night before Good Friday. It was interesting how Jesus at the Last Supper took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." He took the cup out of the Pesach, the Passover, and said, "This cup represents my blood, which is being shed for you." And so the Passover was fulfilled in Jesus Christ in terms of the New Testament. I'm reminded of a song that we learned when I was a boy. You never hear it much today, but it made an impression upon me. I will sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me, how he left his home in glory for the cross of Calvary. Yes, I'll sing the wondrous story of the Christ who died for me. Sing it with the saints in glory, gathered by the crystal sea. I was lost But Jesus found me, found the sheep that went astray. Threw his loving arms around me, drew me back into his way. I was lost, but Jesus healed me. Faint was I from many a fall. Sight was gone and fears possessed me, but he freed me from them all. And right across from that is the other hymn. Christ our Redeemer died on the cross, died for the sinner, paid all his due. All who receive him need never fear. Yes, he will pass over you. When I see the blood, when I see the blood, when I see the blood, the hymn goes, I will pass over you.